Just use them. Hey, birds and
Like what we can show. We tried to show like for years, like on football groups for us. Like
You can pinch a lot of people in this classroom today. She's wearing green on St. Patrick's Day. Yeah. Pinch a lot of people in this classroom today. Pinch a lot of people in this classroom today. Yeah.
a little bit of background about figuring out how to balance those cost trade-offs of we're going to need to take care of our body self-maintenance as well as feed our chick, and that can put a lot of stress on the birds. And so how we're actually looking at the foraging biology, going because we have so many years of data. We already have 4 years of GPS tracks. We have over 600 individual birds that have been tagged. So it gives us a really large subset to try to pick apart why the birds are foraging this way, what's influencing their foraging behavior, and that gives us more statistical analysis and power for figuring that out. And so these units are great. They aren't as precise as the units that are going to cost about $1,000, $2,000. But for what we're looking at, they work really well. They aren't waterproof, which is unfortunate, so we end up putting them actually in 2 condoms to waterproof them, and then you tape them to the bird's tail, and we try to put them at the base of the tail, and you can see it better here. You can barely even see the unit, so it's really streamlined. And then what I'm actually doing with these GPS tracks, I'm hopefully going to be comparing them to environmental parameters in the future, but just from the actual GPS data themselves, I'm going to be looking at several different things. So farthest distance, like as the crow flies, how far out do they go away from the colony? The total trip distance, they make these large loops that you'll see, so how far they mention, which you can get with the higher ArcGIS programs. So I ended up downloading a trial of Esri 10.3 in order to get it. And it seems pretty cool. It seems really good for exploring data so far and extracting basic parameters. It doesn't seem as good for analysis yet. Still figuring it out. So you have to upload your shapefile. You create your shapefile the usual way. You upload it to this track manager. And how it works is it associates the date and time standpoints and puts them into a track. So it associates all those points together. And then you can also have all of your tracks. So I could have 100 different individual tracks in one shapefile, and it will separate that out based on however I decide. And then I was just going to show you guys what I was working. No. Works differently on my monitor. Okay, we'll just go with it. So you can actually play your track in real time, which seemed pretty cool because you could then get a sense of how to further analyze your data and maybe ask questions about what you want to do with it. And so what I've uploaded here are 4 tracks. We have them on 4 different birds. So we have a young bird, age 6 to 7 years, a middle-aged bird, 12 to 13 years, an older bird, and then an oldest bird, because I mentioned they live until 26. And so we targeted these age groups because we're trying to look at the whole spread of their reproductive success. They don't have, and so we try to group them with those 4 age groups. These are 4 different ages, and hopefully it'll play for you. And you can see, this is our, also start to see like these really tight movements over here, and that seems to suggest they found a spot with a lot of prey, and they're spending more time circling and trying to forage. Their speeds also increase in those areas, so it seems like they are hanging out there because the prey is pretty good. And then on the background here, there's a spatial analysis pack. So I'm hoping to tie in some of this distance bearing, these parameters from the GPS tracks into environmental parameters to pick that out. We don't have GPS tracks from the early 80s, unfortunately, that aren't as precise. Sometimes if you lose a satellite out there, and all of a sudden it records, even though the bird hasn't moved, they'll say it's moved 270 kilometers. That happened a couple times when I was looking at the data. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But just for that specific track that we just looked at, so for example, those units, they were put on the birds on December 11th. We checked the nest 6 times a day. The 2 birds finally departed on December 12th, like 100 or 500 of them. They are color coded by age, which is hard to tell. So what's interesting though is these yellow weird ones, those are all young birds, and you don't usually see them doing, like, this is the first time we've ever seen a bird go west of the island. We also had a couple birds this season go directly south. That's the first time we've ever seen that, and those are all young birds. So there's probably some experiential learning, because a lot of the older birds all have this tendency to go about 45 degrees. Low females are the red, and there's maybe some difference. Like if you were to do bearings, I think the females would be a little bit farther up and the males would be a little more horizontal. But this is just part of the season's data, and we have information from 2010, 2012, and 13, and last year and this year so far. We're hoping to get 3 more years to see how that is changing. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions about tracking analysts or the project, I guess? I didn't get as much time to do the analysis. The Excel and ArcMap don't like dates and times. You have to put them into specific formats, so I got stuck doing that for a while. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that. I got really excited. Mhm. And what also is interesting that I'm hoping to analyze more this summer is that the birds, I mean, these were only 4 tracks that we looked at, but they all seem to sort of do a clockwise motion. And some seabirds have also shown that it seems to be due to wind. But the wind, because of that direction and their tracks aren't that far separate, there seems to be something else going on besides just wind causing that. Because often when you see it, like an albatross near Antarctica, they're doing huge looping clockwise patterns, whereas these are a lot tighter, so maybe not just wind. Yeah, that was kind of our, well, not our goal, but this season was supposed to be a weak El Nino, and so we were hoping to pick up maybe some changes with that. And so maybe we will have in the tracks, but it went from like 70% chance in September to when we were out there in December, like 30% chance of a weak El Nino. And where we are in the archipelago, I don't think we get as much of the effects. It seems to be more the west and northern end of it that experiences that. Those are directional ellipses, and it was a tool pack for calculating the average directional like compass bearing that individual bird took from the colony. Within the tracking analyst, you can also and so you can get specifics like that between each point. And I might break these tracks apart in the future to try to get like a straight line, like going from here all the way out to the very tip. As far as it goes would be ideal. Mhm. Yeah, they really seem to go farther out where they find, and then if I could play it again, but they tend to just book it. I like it. Yeah, definitely being able to visualize it. And then you can code it in so many ways. I think it would be cool to color code it for like the nighttime to see if they are sitting. It seems like they're sitting and drifting on the water, so it still shows movement. But we can characterize that as like less than 10 kilometers per hour. Maybe that qualifies them as sitting and not moving. Greater than 10 kilometers per hour is they're flying. It gives you altitude, but I don't think it's accurate at all. They move until there's light the next morning. Sometimes when there's a full moon, you'll see them moving more, and maybe there would be something with that. But otherwise, they just sit on the water. And so you will see that they have a bunch of holes in their feet, because predators, when they're sitting on the water, will just come up and nibble on their feet. And so that is a cost for maybe why they wouldn't want to spend overnight on the water foraging. Yeah. Mm-mm. Oh, okay. Yeah. Mhm. You don't want to. Uh-huh.
How's everybody doing? Good spring break? Everybody's refreshed? Some of you are tan. There's another PowerPoint of RAS.
really designed rasters, whereas ARC is really designed for vectors. Okay, we don't need that slide. You guys know all this. So temperatures, precipitation, these are all typically raster-based data sets. So if you're going to download information on temperature, you're going to be downloading a raster cover type. Very common data set you'll find out there. Soil types, these are all rasters, where each cell has a unique ID. An example, if they're coarse, it's we get a huge amount of distortion in the objects we're trying to represent, but we're not taking up a lot of space. Our data is very small. As we get smaller and smaller and smaller, our data gets larger and changing in resolution. So this is our study area. It's a 30-kilometer square. So if we have an ETM or a Landsat scene with a 30-meter pixel, as we jump up, we use a different resolution here. We're going to 250 meters for each one of those grids. You can see how quickly we're going to lose a lot of that definition of our features. You can't really distinguish the roads anymore. Everything's becoming blobby. We go to 500, even more so, and then we get up to a kilometer with our MODIS pixels, and you can see you're losing pretty much. You can tell sort of this is urban, but there's definitely no way you'd be able to tell that there's a road there. So that is just an example of what happens as we change our cell size. So when we talk about our cell size, we're talking about the height and the width. So as I said, we're always using equally sized pixels. They're going to be equally high and wide. They're squares. And we look at our rows and our columns, and we talk about the resolution of our cell in rows and columns. So here, when we're talking back to this image, we would ask what the resolution of our what's the resolution of our cells. We know that here the resolution of these cells is 30 meters. If we know that, we can figure out other aspects of other properties of our. So these very simple equations that I have put in here are important for you guys when you need to go and calculate something like the number of rows, or the cell size, or the total extent of an image. If you have two of those known, you can solve for the other features. That becomes important when you're trying to do any type of analysis with rasters, because you need everything to line up well. So every program is going to define this somewhat differently, how they number, where they start counting from. In Adreezy, we start counting our rows and columns from the top left corner. So when we're talking about the location in terms of rows and columns, we would start from this point and count over for our columns and down for our rows. The other thing that's important to know is that our coordinate location, so our X and Y location for every pixel, the way that that's recorded in rasters is it records it associated with this lower left-hand corner. So if you want to know where the XY location is in a pixel, it's being determined from the lower left-hand corner, not from, say, the center point. That's another thing that may change depending upon which software program you're using. Okay? Right. Would be 3, yep. 0 in our X and 3 in our Y. So if you have a known location, say an XY coordinate here of this point, if we need to calculate the location of an unknown point in our grid, we're able to do that because we know this location and we know the resolution of each one of our cells. So if we need to know this XY, we can calculate it based upon taking the X value known x value, the number of columns we're traveling, and the resolution of each one of those cells. So we can solve, this is a really simple illustration of it, but if we have a known location, we're able to solve for an unknown location based upon having that resolution information. It's based upon data compression and how the data is stored. When the computer is reading that file, it's starting from the upper left corner and it fills it in that way. So that's why. I think it's typical that it started from the upper. I think because of Cartesian coordinate systems, I think that just doesn't work. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, microphone. I'm sure that's good. Okay. So here, just to show another illustration, if you had that consistency of where your spatial location was the origin point of your cell or where the XY was tied to your cell, you can still do the same analysis because it's still the same distance. So here, as opposed to this one where in Adresi we have it tied to the lower left corner, if you have it tied to the centroid of your pixel, then it's still the same. Okay. I think we're talking about having, say this is a UCM value. It's not always 0. If you have a satellite, it's probably a coordinate that where the prime meridian meets the grid. Okay, so just going over this, our cell size or our resolution we talked about is x is our value this way, and our cell size is y, or our resolution in height is going this way, and the pixels are always going to be the same resolution we're working with. Okay. So the thing about raster analysis is that you have to have alignment of all of your grids. They need to be the same resolution, and they need to all. So if you have, if I'm working in an image and I have a smaller image that I want to do an overlay with, and they don't have the exact same number of rows and columns, that overlay I have to window this bigger one down, or I have to make the smaller one larger in order to do that. Our cell size has to be exactly the same, so we have to have the same resolution of each one of our cells to do an analysis. The project processing step with raster analysis, making sure that everything's ready to do analysis. So how data is represented inside of our picture, pixels. There are a number of different ways that the data can be represented. It can either be discrete or categorical. So this is showing you what a land cover map would look like, where there's a discrete value or category for each one of those cells, or it can be continuous data. That's like temperature, elevation, what that looks like in math, you guys are here's what a discrete or categorical map is looking like, where each one of our land cover types is represented. It has an ID, a numerical value associated with it, as well as here's the category that it's tied to. Versus a continuous map where each one of our cells is going to have a different value. Typically, with continuous data, you have that vary depending upon what your data analysis, what you're trying to do. You can also choose, instead of the average, you can have it represent the conditions of the graph. So how do you represent that pixel? And there's different ways, different strategies to manage that. So here's an example of where you're going to need bytes our data set is. So with our image data type, we either have bytes, which are from 1 byte, which has 8 bits, which is typical, will record columns. So as the computer's reading the data, it's laying it out in that structure. So the documentation file that goes along with the data has the number of rows and columns, typically of a DEM, a digital elevation model. You guys familiar with that term? Some of you maybe not. It's how we store elevation data in a. It's a model based upon the points of known location. You would know that because it's not a byte, right? You've got more than values are ranging from more than 0 to 255. You can record more numerical and what kind of data you're working with, and that's also going to have a lot to do with how large your file sizes are going to be. Okay. So in a raster data set, how is data stored? Numerical value attached. So when you have the whole thing, it's going to take up a lot of room. You're going to represent each one of your features as a separate object. So there's different ways that you can compress that data. This is called, it's called a run length code out into the largest blocks that we have. So we know that there are, these are the largest blocks of constant value. So it's representing those, improving it. They're centers. They do training and all sorts of workshops for people who want to use some of the tools. They're also resellers. So anyway, so there are some things inside of a Adrizi that are freestanding. So they are separate components that you can do analysis without having to do the other. You don't have to have the whole package to work with them. One example here is something called the land change modeler. Adrizi was one of the first people to start developing all of these tools to do predictive modeling of like deforestation, and they worked with Conservation International and developed an extension that you can do this inside of ArcGIS too. The newest version of Adrizi, which we don't have a license for here yet, is called TerraSet, and they've really moved into more of their modeling and monitoring components. So there's a lot of what I think the real strength of Adrizi is, which we'll only touch on a little bit because it's a little bit more sophisticated, are all of these spatial modeling components. So what they really do is that it's been project-based. So they've they worked with Conservation International, who wanted to know not only to have the tools to do predictive deforestation modeling, but then wanted to understand about how to predict the impact on biodiversity or habitat loss. So they have taken a question or a challenge that's so they've also incorporated, they've worked with them as well and developed some of those tools inside of Adrizi. We do have, I have this book if you guys are interested in some of this, but they're not as publication oriented as Esri, so the help resources are not quite at the same level because there's not as many users. But they do have pretty good tutorials and some online forums. But it's a much smaller community to get assistance with. Adrizi does a lot of different types of, has a lot of service offerings too, where they work with groups if they need to be trained, very focused on technology transfer, so making independent users so that they can do their own analysis in the end and not have to pay for the consulting services of them. And then, as I mentioned before, really custom software development. So a lot of the tools that are inside of Adrizi have been developed based upon people who needed specific types of analysis done, and they've built the whole tool set for them. So just some examples of some of the organizations that use Idrizi and specifically the land change modeler. So you know that it may seem like you're not you're learning another software program and it may seem like a pain, but there are actually organizations that might appreciate the fact that you have developed skills in Idrizi as well. Okay. So we are learning a new program, which means we're going to have to get familiar with different types of files again. Fortunately, there are not as many different files and naming conventions in Idrizi as there are in Esri. With Idrizi, typically you're either working with rasters or vectors. And when you're working with a raster, you have to have at least 2 files, not 5 or 6 or 7 like with shape files. You have to have 2. You have to have the whatever the name is, with the RST extension, and then the same thing with the RDC extension. So this is what your image data file looks like, and this is what your documentation file looks like here. Remember, that documentation file is going to have all of that important information. Here's our data type. So here it's a byte. It has the number of rows and columns. It has our reference system. It has what the categories mean down here as well. So you have to have the documentation file in order to open the image file. So you have to have a pair. A raster group file is not important, not always important. It's if you have a whole bunch of raster files that go together. Say you have an image, which typically, like a Landsat image, typically has somewhere between 7 and 11 bands of data, then you would have a raster group file to keep them all together. But you might see that RGF as well. With vectors, again, you have to have 2. You have your vector data file, and then you've got your vector documentation file. And then you'll have something called a VXL, which links your vector spatial data with your attribute data. What you'll notice when you work with vectors in Idrizi is that it's not a vector-based software program. It's definitely a lot more onerous to work with vectors in Idrizi. Whenever I work with vector data, I work in ARC because it just doesn't make sense. But sometimes you want to have basic overlays of vector information inside of your raster program. So again, some of the important components in our RDCs are raster documentation files. So some of these things are going to look more familiar to you now. You'll understand why they're in here, like our reference systems, our units. But as we said before, there's different types of data that our rasters could be stored as. And every raster is going to have the number of rows and columns associated with it as well. There are a couple of other file types, but they're, again, not critical. Sometimes if you put a map composition together, so this has your title, your north symbol, all of the associated representations that you want here in your legends. If you wanted to save that all together, you would save it as a map composition file, sort of similar to your MXD, right, in ARC. So that if you wanted it to be displayed again, you could open that just like this. And then you can also make your own symbols or palette files, which are saved in this format. If you want to see the structure of your raster data set, you can actually see the matrix of how it's composed as well. So again, we're looking at this land cover map, and you can see how it our column and rows, our numerical value starts up here in our upper left-hand corner. So these are the numerical locations of each one of our cells by the rows and columns, and then you can see the data stored in it, what the values are. Right, our XY coordinate. Right. Yeah, upper left, lower left. This upper left, not as critical. I mean, good to know, but it's really the lower left you're going to be thinking about more in your use of it. So there are a lot of different, you can go back and forth, and we'll talk about this more on Thursday, but you can go back and forth between all different data types. You can go back and forth between rasters and vectors. You can change the type of data you're working with. If you're working with integer data and you want to reduce the file size, you can go to binary data or byte data. And there are different choices that you have to make when you go through that process. But so you know, sometimes you'll have to use conversion between your files. If you remember too that I said you have to have the same number of rows and columns to do analysis, sometimes you have to do transformations of the data if you want to be able to do overlays or things like this. So some of the tools here are contract, where you're going to take an image and you're going to reduce the number of rows and columns. So you're going to make your cell size larger, because you're decreasing your cell resolution. So a case where you might want to go from this to this is if you had an image, for instance, that you needed to overlay land use data on that you had in a different resolution. So you might want to take each one of those land use pixels and make them bigger so that they would overlay perfectly with your image to do some sort of an analysis or an extraction. You can also do the opposite. You can expand it. And what you do in this case is you're actually duplicating your pixels so that you can decrease your, make your cell size smaller. Or if you need to have extra rows and columns, for example, if you want your image, the whole image to be larger. Okay, so we're going to go through, when we do raster analysis, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the types of analysis that we use rasters for, and that we're going to go through in class for the rest of the semester. So it's going to sound pretty familiar, database queries. So we did a lot of different queries and vectors. Anyway, any questions you want to ask about where things are, you can do that through database queries. So an example here is, where is corn being grown, like on what types of soils, for example. So typically the way we would do that in a raster analysis is we would go through a reclassification. So we have a soils map here and we have a land use map. So we're going to pull out the areas of interest. We're going to reclassify these maps and create new maps with just those features that we're interested in here. So you have two new reclassified maps, and then you go through what's called an overlay analysis, where you're essentially doing what it says. You're taking and you're overlaying two data sets together to try and determine what the combined features are. So you can do that overlay. You'll remember all of our different types of Boolean logic you could do, or different types of mathematical combinations that you can do to go through that overlay, like the image calculator analysis. Map algebra is what we call when we take two maps or a single map and we can multiply them, or we can change the values within that single map by doing some sort of mathematical transformation. So there's a lot of different types of combinations of map layers we do through map algebra. We do a lot of distance analysis using rasters. You guys are familiar with buffers. You do a lot more things creating surfaces, say cost surfaces. How difficult is it to travel across the surface? You do that a lot in raster analysis. And context. So what are the features, what are sorry, the areas close to you, the contextual features like, and how can you make new maps, new layers based upon that. So an example here is taking an elevation model, and then based upon the context of each one of those pixels, you can create these other layers like the slope, the aspect, the relief. There's a lot of different types of contextual operators that you do in a raster analysis. So we'll go more into all of these and start working with them from here forward. Okay. And questions? I do believe that Jeff is going to be here either during class or lab to help us all install Adreesy on our machines on Thursday. And you guys probably have questions about your projects, or have you not started conferring about them? Okay. You can email me and we'll have time on Thursday to review them. Okay? Okay, great. And I have data for you guys. Yeah. I like that. Then you don't have to ask me any more questions. That's great.